Well, good morning, everybody. I knew it was coming up that I'd be asked to speak sometime in the next year, and then it suddenly got brought forward because of a change of plan.
You weren't second choice.
Well, let me say that if you've come here expecting a talk on motorcycling,
Yes.
get your coat and leave now. The only time I've ever been on a motorcycle in my life was when I was a student, and a friend of mine gave me a lift home on the back of his motorbike, and I said never again. I think Les was showing off, actually. If I'm on two wheels, they're smaller wheels, thinner wheels, and the power comes from my legs only. So. Let me say a couple of things about the title before we get going. 60 years a scientist and a Christian might have prompted you to do a bit of mental arithmetic. The answer is I'm 76. A mere stripling compared with quite a few of you senior citizens here today. And the other thing is, as a scientist, you get used to doing approximations and averaging. And the 60 years is an average, but then the title of 63 years a Christian and 57 and a half years, sorry, the other way around, 63 years a scientist and 57 and a half years a Christian didn't really sound so catchy, but the average is just over 60. So the story begins in 1949, when I was born in a town called Great Harwood. It's about the same size as Hexham, on the very northern edge of industrial Lancashire. I've still got the accent. That's between Blackburn and Burnley. So lots of towns and industry to the south, down to Manchester and beyond. But to the north it's rural. You've got the Ribble Valley, you've got the Forest of Bowland, and we were right on the edge of that. My parents, my father was himself a Lancastrian, born in Longridge, north of Preston, and he was from a big family. He had 5 sisters and 2 brothers surviving, and when he was a child he was very interested in cooking. He wanted to be a chef. The war got in the way, though he did enjoy cooking, even later in life, and he spent the war mostly as a paratrooper on active service in the Far East, but he was stationed for a very short time in Norfolk, where he met my mother, who was 14 at the time. My father was during my childhood, he was actually a lorry driver. Mostly driving long distance with big tankers. And I learned at a very early age how to deal with car engines and things like that. And also how to read maps. And map reading is still one of the things I love doing. My mother, she came from Norfolk, from the Broads area, agricultural background. She was quite a few years younger than my father, and when I was born she was 21. My father was 30. I was the first of 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls, and we were a typical working class family, not rich by any means, but not poor either, just about got along. I can remember the very first week my father brought his pay packet home and it had £20 in it. I can remember that day. And we went every year down to Norfolk on holiday to visit my mother's parents. That, to me, was what holidays were. So, learned a lot of skills as a child. I think my parents were a bit unusual because all 4 of us, 2 boys, 2 girls, we all learned to knit, to sew, to cook, to lay bricks, to do other DIY, to do decorating, and so on. there was no gender stereotyping in the family. I think that was quite unusual. And before I went to school, I could read and write, because I was that keen to learn. In fact, I was a bit of the odd one out in our family. I was the only intellectual in the family. And the first one ever to go to grammar school, never mind university. Local schools to begin with, primary schools, and then had to hop on a school bus to get to my grammar school in Accrington, of Stanley fame, 4 miles away. As I say, the first in the family ever to do that. I did a usual range of O-levels, A-levels, which I did in sciences by choice. I could have done languages. My language teachers were disappointed that I chose to do science. When I was 11, I wanted to be a teacher. When I was 12, I changed my mind and I was going to be a doctor. You might say I am actually a doctor, and I have been a teacher. But when I was 13, I made my mind up. I was going to go to Cambridge to study chemistry and do work in university research. And that's what I've done. Now, I don't know why I made that decision, but I stuck with it. The influences on me at school were particularly my headmaster, actually. He didn't teach me very much, except in 1 or 2 lessons where there was a member of staff away. He was a mathematician. He also taught German and philosophy. He was a very strict disciplinarian, but he was an extremely accomplished musician. He was a brilliant pianist, and he and the music teacher used to do piano duets as a sort of entertainment at various events and so on. And he encouraged me academically. He also encouraged me musically, to the extent that he would even play the piano for me to sing occasionally at break time. And that was a good encouragement, because I came from a not very musical family at all. I never ever liked any form of rock music. I've always been a classical musician, and I think a lot of that was encouraged by my head teacher. I did learn to play the violin for a couple of years, but I got no encouragement at home, so that went. I taught myself 1 or 2 instruments, but nothing to any high level. My main instrument's been the most portable one there is, this one. So I've always been very keen on singing, and that was encouraged by my head teacher. Reading music is one of the skills that I'm particularly glad I did. I did that mostly by learning the recorder at junior school. And another of the things that I taught myself while I was still at school, which I've been very glad of, has been touch typing, because I've never had a secretary in my life, and I've done an awful lot of writing and typing. When I was at school, I was also, very briefly, I played chess. I played once for the school and won, and retired with a 100% record. After that, I got more interested in playing bridge, and even played in the national schools championship competition. I was never ever a sportsman. Any sport that involves either a team or a ball, no, useless. So when I was at school, I did cross-country running. I went to church and Sunday school. My parents didn't, but they sent us. My brothers and sisters gradually faded out of it, but I carried on. I didn't really have any personal faith at the time. Of course, I didn't realise I didn't have any personal faith. It was fairly nominal. I was involved, I was interested. I've always been a creature of habit, a bit perhaps on the margins of OCD. And so once I got into going to church, I just stuck with it. And also there was a chance to sing and even play the harmonium there. I decided in my final year at school, when I knew I was going to go off to Cambridge as a student, that perhaps it was time to drop this habit, and I was going to stop going to church. God had other ideas. And just before I went off to university, a lifelong friend of mine suddenly changed her way of life, and she'd become a Christian. And I was intrigued. What on earth is going on here? So I went along to investigate, went along to where she was going, was confronted within a week by challenges that I had never seen and heard before. And the lady who had a lot to do with me becoming a Christian, she suddenly said to me at the end of whatever I was doing at a prayer meeting, I don't know. But I was at a prayer meeting held in a hostel for destitute women. Let's not go there. That's just where they happened to meet. And she just said, "Do you want to be saved?" Well, yes, I suppose so. And she told me afterwards she'd never asked that question so bluntly before, but she just felt moved to do it. So I'm one of those people who can put a date on my conversion to Christian faith. It was in September 1967. I was 18 years old, and it was 3 weeks before I was due to go off to university. God has wonderful timing and a great sense of humour. So it was a new start, an exciting adventure. I was going to leave home for the first time in independence. I was going to be a student at a very prestigious place, and I'd just become a Christian. So I spent 6 years in Cambridge, 3 years as an undergraduate, studying natural sciences, of which chemistry is part. That's the way it works there. I lived 2 years out in student digs, and then 1 year in college. And then for the next 3 years, I was a postgraduate student working for my PhD in the subject of X-ray crystallography, which is part of chemistry. It's how you work out the structures of molecules, and that's been my research ever since. I did a tiny bit of teaching even then. I was doing tutorials for undergraduate students at my supervisor's college. Gave me a bit of money, which was helpful. So one of the big influences there, of course, was the Christian Union. I met somebody just before I went to Cambridge in Blackburn who was a student at Cambridge and a Christian, and he said, "Come and meet me when you get to Cambridge, and I'll introduce you to the president of the Christian Union, who happened to be in the same college as him." So I very quickly made some Christian friends, found out who my college representatives were. You have individual CUs in the colleges in Cambridge. And I went and bashed on his door and said, "Hello, I've just become a Christian. I want to know about the Christian Union." I'm told afterwards he went straight off to his fellow representative and said, "I've got this really keen man turned up." So I was very much involved in the Christian Union throughout my time. In fact, I was a college leader for a year. It was a tremendous privilege that we really took for granted and didn't realise how well off we were with the fantastic, brilliant, well-known speakers we got week after week after week to come and speak. People like John Stott, who came for a whole term, Saturday by Saturday, and the talks he gave to us became one of his commentaries. I also was very much involved in a Brethren church for most of my 6 years there. The style, the teaching, the warm welcome appealed to me, and I was baptised there a few months after starting. For my postgraduate time of 3 years, I ended up living in a place called Tyndale House. Now, Tyndale House is a residential biblical library. So most of the people living there were theologians, but they never filled their rooms with theologians, and they offered rooms out to people who were sympathetic, which really meant CU people. And I lived for 3 years in Tyndale House. It was very convenient because it was fully catered. I got 3 meals a day there. It was well looked after, and I was among Christians. The warden at the time was a man called Derek Kidner. Derek Kidner was a very well-known Old Testament scholar. He was also a brilliant pianist who gave up a career as a concert pianist professional to go into theology. and he played for me to sing occasionally. There was some amusing times there when we had theological conferences, people coming to stay during the vacations when undergraduates weren't there. But I was there because we didn't have the same holidays as undergraduates. And people come in and say, "Oh, hello, how are you? What do you do?" And I said, "I do crystallography." "Oh, yes, Christology," they would say. That confusion's been there quite a bit. I did quite a lot of singing. I sang in the Gilbert and Sullivan Society and got on stage. That was really where I got started with singing. I later joined the really big Cambridge University Musical Society chorus for the last couple of years, and sang in King's College Chapel and several cathedrals. That was David Wilcox was the conductor at the time, went on to be the conductor of the Bard Choir in London. You've probably, if you've not sung, you'll have heard some of his music, because a lot of those twiddly descants for Christmas carols that you get were written by David. But the most important singing I did there was for my last 3 years in a Christian choir, small Christian choir, mostly students but not all, called the Ichthyon Singers. Now, Ichthyon Singers, that's after ichthus, which is the Greek for fish. And indeed, everybody who's sung in that choir has been known ever since as Old Fish. It was also a great marriage bureau, and it's where I met my wife. And her sister met her husband as well in the same choir. Both sisters were in Cambridge, 3 years apart. And it's where I did my first preaching as well, because the choir used to go around and lead services in churches around the area, and we took it in turns to do the preaching and illustrated with our music. We also went every Easter, Holy Week, on a tour somewhere, Bolton, Sheffield, Chester, Bath, and so on. And we went on holiday for a week together somewhere, Wales or Scotland or something. When I got married in 1975, 2 years after leaving Cambridge, it was a double wedding, because the two sisters wanted to get married at the same time. So we had a double wedding, which involved the 4 people getting married after signing the register, turning around and singing a quartet in service. That's how much it meant to us. I've never found it difficult to get into choirs for 2 reasons. One, I'm an endangered species called a tenor, and they're always crying out for tenors. And the other is I'm very good at sight reading, so I can pick up a piece of music and just sing it, which is a big advantage. Other interests in Cambridge, I was one of the owners of a punt. We did do some punting. It's where I first started cycling. Never cycled as a child. Knew within 1 day of being in Cambridge I had to get a bike because I couldn't get to my lectures. So there we are. I didn't play any more bridge, there wasn't time. The other thing I got involved in while I was in Cambridge for the first time was an organisation called the Research Scientist Christian Fellowship, which is now called Christians in Science. Because to me, as a new Christian, seriously studying science, the interaction of those two was really important, and I needed to explore it because there were so many myths around about them being incompatible. They aren't, they never have been. It's a 19th century invention, the conflict, and it's not true. So I read a lot of interesting books, went to talks, even made my first conference presentation representing our local group at a one-day conference speaking about scientific and Christian understanding of miracles. In 1973, I left Cambridge and got my first job. It was here in Newcastle. On a 3-year job, which was extended to 5, and involved teaching and research. I did some lecturing for the first time. I was writing a lot of my own publications. I spent 2 years in a student hall of residence, Henderson Hall.
Yes.
Yeah. Got married then in 1975, and we moved to Wallsend. And through all that time I was going to Heaton Baptist Church. Our first child was born just a year later in 1976, and the next one in 78. And I sang in the Newcastle Bar Choir, which I still sing in. And I went on my first international conferences. One of those was a conference, a European crystallographic meeting, which was held in Oxford in 1977. I happened to meet there an ex-colleague, a member of staff from Cambridge University, and we were having a conversation, and he said something to me about next year, and I said, well, that depends if I got a job next year, because my present job's finishing and I'm looking for a job. He said, oh, how do you fancy a job in Germany? Because he was just about to move to a new post in Germany. Well, I'll have to go home and ask about that. But that's how we ended up in Germany. It was what anybody else would say was a chance conversation. It wasn't a chance conversation, of course. This was God at work again. So 1978, we moved to the city of Göttingen. Not particularly well known in this country, but is well known in Germany. It's a good university with two very small children and a brand new car with the driving on the correct side. Now those were 6 really quite important years for my career development. I did some teaching, but mainly research. We had good facilities. I developed new interests and experiences, went on a lot of conferences, and started teaching on summer schools with a particular subject that I got deeply into. And we had 2 more children while we were there. It's a bit of a standard joke within my colleagues that as a crystallographer whose work is all about regularity and symmetry and so on, I have 4 children. They're girl, boy, and they're equally spaced in age. We were involved in a Baptist church in Germany where I joined the choir straight away. They were very glad to have another tenor. And then later on I actually took over conducting the choir, which is the first time I'd ever done that in my life. We made a lot of new friends, and I learned a very important thing in Germany, what it was like to be a foreigner. And I've always appreciated ever since the difficulties that people have in living in another country. I followed the German standard career path, which involved a process called the Habilitation. It's a German doctorate, and it's the standard qualification for going on to be a professor at a German university. But we preferred to return to the UK because we didn't actually like the school system in Germany, and our children were very bright and would have been held back by the very really regular German system. So in 1984, we returned to Newcastle, which I hadn't expected to do, to a lectureship, and then got promoted up the ranks afterwards. And now this was full-scale teaching, research and administration. I got my first research grant, which I applied for while we were in Germany. I've taken on a lot of departmental and university responsibilities over these years, served on lots of committees, chaired some committees. I chaired the University Safety Committee for 6 years. But I got a pay rise out of it, and I served on Senate 3 times. Lots of conferences, teaching on summer schools. I've written some textbooks, produced a lot of publications, and had a lot of research grants. I took on some new directions of research in the 1990s, and got involved in international research facilities, a facility called synchrotron radiation, which is extremely intense X-rays that you can't produce in your own lab. And in fact, I led a major project to build some new facilities in Cheshire, near Warrington, a place called Daresbury Laboratory. And in fact, the job was so important there that they paid half my salary for 3 years from the laboratory, which paid for a lecturer temporary lecturer to do some of my teaching, which expanded my research group. And I was away from home 1 week every 2 weeks during that period. Now, that turned out to be a good thing, as I'll mention in a minute. When we first came back to this country, we lived in Stamfordham for about 10 years, where the kids absolutely loved the first school, brilliant school, and we got involved in lots of village activities. We did not want to be dormitory people. So that's how I got into amateur dramatics in the village. We ended up in those years, we moved on from Stamfordham to Kingston Park when we had 4 teenagers. We did manage to get 4 teenagers just for a year. And I didn't want to be a full-time taxi driver. So we moved into Kingston Park, where the kids could still go to school in Ponteland by public transport. And then when I retired in 2009, we moved to Prudhoe. So we were involved in a range of churches of different denominations over that time: Methodist, URC, Anglican. And in Kingston Park, where one of the reasons we chose to live there was because it had an ecumenical church. 4 denominations, 3 when we first went, the Baptist joined later. 4 denominations just working and worshipping together with nobody caring what denomination you were from. That is what I like. I also did some theological training during that time. Got a certificate in theology from Spurgeon's College by writing essays before breakfast for several years. It was distance learning, so that I'm accredited as a Baptist preacher now. Now, I had 2 significant crises of faith during those years, and I'll just mention. The first one was because we made an attempt, which was a complete failure, to share a house with my wife's sister and her husband. Frankly, it didn't work. I think that there were just too many incompatibilities that we couldn't get over, and we had to face up to that, and there were difficult relationships through that. I realised there was something wrong with me inside, as well as all the external issues there. On a church weekend at Scargill House in Yorkshire, when during a communion service at the end of that, I suddenly thought, I'm going through the motions, this doesn't mean anything. And I just lost my faith somehow. I'd been drifting without realising it. And for the next few months I was absolutely miserable and living on other people's faith. In the end, I actually went back for a weekend to the same place by arrangement with the chaplain there, who was a great pastoral worker. Spent some time with him and got restored. There are certain things, certain passages of the Bible and certain songs that are now very precious to me from that time. The other time was when my wife, Kathy, developed ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, as it's better called these days. And she went down with that and could not do normal things. This was at a time when our kids were teenagers, so they were able to help and look after themselves. But she found that obviously very difficult. I found it very difficult. There was an enormous strain on our relationship for several years. It was during that time that I was seconded down to Cheshire for half my time. And that separation really helped a lot to cope with that. She gradually got over it. She's not had any recurrence. She was out of action for about 7 years. It has had an impact over the years, but we got over that. And God kept us together. It doesn't always happen with that situation. I got back into involvement with Christians in Science during this time. Went to some meetings and conferences. I started a local group for Newcastle and Northumberland. It's never really got big enough to be successful, though it's still chundering along. I organised some regional conferences, and I interacted with the Christian Union at the university to put on some question and answer events where we have a panel of Christian scientists, and I put a space between those words for obvious reasons. We're not Christian scientists. And where they could throw any questions at us. Guerrilla Christian scientist. That was quite scary. But we never ever got any nasty questions. They were always really serious and good. I got a grant from an organisation during that time to put on some talks on science and faith in the Tyne Valley. And this was in the 1997. And a couple of them were in Hexham, at the school in Hexham. Others were at different places in the valley, down as far as Bladen. And at this stage, a lot of the money that I got in this grant was for publicity. And so I was getting posters and things like that, putting adverts in. And I wrote to the Tyne Valley Express and said, can I advertise my events? And they said, that sounds interesting. Would you like to write some articles on science, from scientific topics from a Christian viewpoint? So I did, for quite a while, up to COVID. During COVID, I wrote a double-length article about viruses and bacteria and the differences and so on. And I got a lot of positive feedback on this from people. And then I wrote the next one on conspiracy theories. And it didn't get published, because it turns out the editor was a conspiracy theorist who actually believed the nonsense that I was debunking in this article. So I had to stop writing for them, but I've carried on writing such articles and putting them now on a website. Every 2 months I do an update. I've just done one, which is on the subject of can we afford big science? You know, the really big space exploration and central facilities and so on. Yeah. I've been a trustee of Christians in Science for 6 years now, which gives me another 3 years to go before I have to step down. And I took over as chair last year. There's a lot of developments going on there. Just briefly, towards the end now, I'm involved in a lot of things. I have a lot of interests. I'm one of these people who simply cannot do nothing. If I go on holiday, one thing I can't do is lie on the beach. No way. I have to put my walking boots on and get going. So I'm still doing some research activities in the university, despite being retired for 15 years. I go to conferences and so on. At church, I do some regular preaching and leading worship. And I've just taken over as church secretary. I'm one of these people who can't somehow manage to say no. I still sing in the bar choir in Newcastle. And I go on stage with the Ovington Drama Group in pantomimes. Oh, yes, I do. And so on.
Anyone's seen it before, yeah.
I help to run a couple of retired people's organisations. I like to do a lot of walking, sometimes even go camping. Obviously family, I've got 3 grandchildren as well, 2 of them local. And I've been doing a lot more cycling. It's my one bit of fitness. I've got to do something to keep fit. Culminating in last year, I cycled from Land's End to John O'Groats in September, 1,008 miles, partly to raise money for charities, including Christians in Science. But there it is, I did it. Let me just mention to finish what I think are some of the current issues on the science and faith interface that we need to tackle. Like a lot of other things, not just with science, the question people ask these days is no longer, is it true? It's, does it work? That's much more the question people are asking. You don't give people now evidence for the resurrection. You explain why it matters and what difference it makes. So, scientific and other objective truth and authority is questioned these days. what they call postmodernism, and we have to tackle that. People just don't necessarily believe that science has anything useful to say to them. There's a decline of concern about conflict. The idea that science and faith are in conflict, that's gone at the highest levels, at the thinking levels. Unfortunately, although that's dead, along with some of the new atheists who promoted it, although it's dead, its ghost is still there. And an awful lot of people still think that's the default position. Science and faith are incompatible. It's a load of rubbish, of course. But we do have to address it. Nowadays, it's more, well, is it relevant? Yeah? Is science relevant? And is Christian faith relevant to our normal life? There are a lot of misunderstandings about science. Some people think it's too hard. A lot of people say, oh, no, I never get this at school. Some people think science is actually evil, and that it's anti-God. There are misunderstandings about Christian faith, that it's irrational. It certainly isn't. That it's anti-science, which it isn't.
No.
I mean, God is the ultimate scientist.
Yes.
You know, if God speaks through his word and he speaks through his creation,
Yes.
and it's the same author, he's not stupid enough to contradict himself.
No.
Yeah, that's basic understanding. Or that faith is purely for you, it's personal, it doesn't apply to me. You know, there's no absolute truth. And there is negative input from some scientists, from atheists, of course, and there is negative input, unfortunately, from some sections of the Christian church who are against science and think that it's against the Bible and so on, which it isn't.
No.
So those are some of the issues that we're still trying to face in Christians in Science, and I'll leave it at that.
That was brilliant. Thank you.